I grew up in Saskatchewan, didn't grow up in a Bible-believing church, didn't grow up in a Christian home, not hearing the gospel till I was 24 years old. And so to look where I'm at now is crazy. A lot of people wonder, well, you live in Canada, so surely, you would have heard about the gospel, heard about Jesus. Well, it really depends on where you grew up. There are pockets and areas, even in our province, Saskatchewan, across the country, where there are great Bible-believing churches and people grew up hearing the gospel from childhood. But the area where I grew up, you would have to drive an hour any direction and you wouldn't find a Bible-believing church. So I grew up not knowingly meeting any Christians. Even that language, talking about, well, somebody's a Christian or not, like that wasn't even on the radar. God wasn't on the radar. People have an idea maybe of what their experience is or what they may think it is in Canada, but there are really not that many Christians in Canada. When you start talking statistically, there's a small number of gospel-believing Christians in this country. And there's whole areas where there's no Bible-believing church at all. Hi, I'm Murray McClellan, one of the pastors in Grace Fellowship in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. Saskatoon is where I went to university, became a phys ed teacher, and that's what I was doing in a village north of Saskatoon where we now are. So I was married, had a son, happily going through life, and God decided to interrupt that, and glad that he did. The first Christian that I was really aware of, someone who actually professed to be a Christian that I had ever met, was this farmer who was the parent, one of the girls in my class. He's the one that would steer conversation to spiritual things, and yet he was gracious. I remember him sitting on a bus. He came to chaperone one of the ski trips. He said, I don't mean to offend you, but could I ask you a question? And I remember saying finally, okay, one question. That's, and then let's get on to other topics, that I'm more comfortable with. And so he basically said, if this bus was to crash and you were to die, what would happen to you? And at that point, looking back, I realized now it was the very Spirit of God. And there was three things that just flashed through my mind. And I realized, wow, there is a God. And when I die, I'm going to stand before him. And he needs to send me to hell. I deserve it. And I just knew that, was convicted of that at that point, which is really strange considering I didn't even believe in God, certainly didn't believe in the Bible, didn't believe in heaven or hell. And yet in that moment, I knew it was true. I knew there was a God, and I knew what I deserved. And so grace was exceedingly sweet when 3 weeks later, the church planter of a church of a town just nearby, who was also the driver trainer, ended up through a series of circumstances, he and his wife ended up at our house. This is where I met Jesus. I remember asking him about drinking. What's the Bible say about drinking? And he said, well, really, whether you drink or don't drink isn't the biggest issue. It's where do you stand with God? I had figured that out a few weeks earlier on the bus with that farmer. So he just kept steering everything back to the gospel. And that was really wise. And God just used that in that moment in time to open my eyes to the reality of who he is and who Jesus was. And really the answer to the great need of the great problem that was established on that bus. I'm just so thankful that when God first opened my eyes and brought me to himself, that we were saved into this new church plant. The church planter bought this house right across from the school, great location. And it's in here, this addition was built on just shortly after I came to faith in Jesus. It's here we studied the Bible. Here's where I learned about Jesus. Here's where I read the Bible really and learned about the gospel for the first time. And what was really cool about this little church plant is that I would say out of the first 24 people, there were really only 3 that had grown up in church. The rest of us were just brand new Christians, and it ran like a little Bible school. I mean, we asked questions and we were taught through the scriptures, and it was just great to be a brand new Christian with this new family. It was only about 3 months in my Christian faith, and the church planter asked me if I would consider meeting with him on Saturday mornings for being equipped and trained and learning. So I don't know if he saw that this guy needs a lot of help, so I better give him some one-on-one time, or whether he saw something in me that he wanted to just grow and develop. But so we began meeting at his home every Saturday, and we'd have an hour of systematic theology, a study in a book of the Bible, and he started teaching me Greek. I was trained then by the pastor, the church planter, just within the context of the local church. So in time, God actually had us move to Alberta. just outside of Edmonton, where we lived also for 3 years, and I taught in a school nearby there. And then in a strange way God works, he actually brought us back to Saskatchewan, back to Leask, which was the very town where the church plant was, and which God saved me, and my wife in the meantime had come to faith in Jesus as well. And only this time it was called back now to pastor the very church that I was saved in. So as time went on, we certainly wanted to continue to be an outreaching church. We focused on some outreaches on the First Nation communities nearby. We had what we called an evening of theology in the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. During that time, God in His grace had a number of people make professions of faith in Jesus. As God really began to do some things in Saskatoon, we realized that God was beginning a church. We didn't really set out to plant a church. That wasn't our intent in the beginning. We just wanted to bear witness of the gospel, but we could clearly see that God was doing something. And so that led us to be intentional then about actually starting a church. We knew we just couldn't do this alone, and I felt very ill-equipped, very weak for this endeavor. And so we began to look at who could we maybe partner with to see the gospel really advance in our city and beyond into places in our province. With our theological convictions, with the mission we felt we were called to, with our understanding of what is the church and what the church's purpose really is for, we just felt in every case we'd have to compromise something or an area. And then God in His grace connected us with this global network called Acts 29, and began looking at that and began making connections. And the more we dug in, we realized, yeah, this is home. This fits who we are, with no compromise, that we really did feel, yeah, we're part of Acts 29. And this allows us to be part of something so much greater than ourselves. The network was just a huge blessing and a catalyst to keep us centered on the gospel, keep us focused on the mission that Jesus had for His church. That being poured into by these brothers is what's really helped keeping me stirred up for the gospel, stirred up for the mission of Jesus. And then in turn, when that gets poured into me, what do? I come back to the home church and I just pour it back into these people. So it's just been indispensable, really, this relationship that we've had as a part of Acts 29. So this is a school. I was a high school teacher. First of all, I was a phys ed teacher. And then once the church plant really got going, I switched into math. Then I wasn't doing all the extracurricular in the weekends, which allowed us then to be in Saskatoon. The last years, even when we began the church plant in Saskatoon, this was my day job, high school teacher. We would carpool out here with a number of teachers. There was probably 5, 6 of us, and we'd carpool to drive out here, and we'd live then in Saskatoon, and that's where we then focused on developing that core team for our church plant. God gifted me with this position to provide for our needs. And it's really good, I think, in our culture and our setting. When people would ask you what you do or anything like that, I could say I'm a high school teacher. And then pastoring and the church planting was my passion. So there was no confusion that that was just sort of a job, or that I was just clergy, or however else they would view it. So they would see that I was a real person with a real job, and that the church and making disciples was the core of our life.
As we were starting out, our core team was really small in Saskatoon, and we had big dreams to church plant downtown and be a church for the city that planted multiple churches throughout the province. But the truth was, we didn't have a lot of up-and-coming leaders. Clay Bittner and I, we were interns together.
I just love that Murray intentionally took the time to disciple these 2 young guys who really didn't know what we were doing. But by God's grace, He saw in us a passion for the gospel, and He wanted to stir that up in us and train us to become pastors and church planters.
For us, even in our core phase, we were really just gathering our core team together before we actually launched sort of publicly in 2011. We gathered just a number of different young guys, started to pour into them the same way that church planter had first poured into me.
And what I really appreciate about Murray's leadership was he didn't treat us as someone who had 30 years experience over us, even though he did. He treated us as equals, and yet he still discipled us and brought us along. He was very humble in the way that he taught us, and he gave us responsibility really that we may not have been able to handle at our age or experience, but yet that's what actually gave us the ability to grow and to learn from. So I always appreciated his leadership style during that season.
One of the most pivotal moments in our church plant when we planted Grace Saskatoon was during that first year. We lost a big chunk of our giving, and I just remember, man, we should not have survived as a church plant.
And we came together at my house, at a small house in the West End, and Clay and Kim, Murray and Cheryl, Allison and myself, we all met together to pray. And what's amazing is in that moment, we felt God was calling us to continue and that he would provide a way. And there was no earthly reason to believe that, but yet we know God was calling us to something bigger beyond ourselves that we were even capable of in the moment.
And in his grace, God just allowed us to grow and have people meet Jesus and people baptized, and what we now call gospel communities as families of missionaries really in our own culture, continuing to take the gospel outward. And then we launched meeting in a movie theater downtown in January 2011.
The first time we walked into the theater, I know my kids were like blown away. They're like, we have church here. Like we can do church in a place like this. And it was a neat experience. One of the first things I remember is just the people, how much they welcomed you right away. Like new people introduced themselves. They made sure, we felt welcome right away.
So Alicia and I were really looking to be a part of a church that was gospel-centered and mission-focused. And so we started attending Grace Saskatoon. As we got to know the church more and more and got to know the elders of the church and the church structure, we really fit into that church well. And we really felt like Grace Saskatoon lived what they preached and taught. And so we became really involved in the church. In
2015, as the church in Saskatoon continued to grow, after a lot of prayer and discernment, we planted in the small city of Warman, which is just north of Saskatoon.
It was decided that Clay and Kim would plant Grace Warman along with Alicia and I. And so that's how Grace Warman came to be.
And so that became then our first plant out of our church plant.
Grace Saskatoon took a big hit when we planted out in Warman.
Financially, it was one thing. They supported us for the first few years when we couldn't support ourselves with rent and equipment and all those things.
But the biggest price Saskatoon paid was the people cost. They sent us some of their best musicians, best tech team. I mean, they were willing to give whatever we needed for us to succeed. It was amazing.
And then more recently, we've planted a new area of Saskatoon.
In September of 2019, we were sent out from Grace Saskatoon. There's a core group of us, so with the Whitehawks, and I think there's about 20-ish of us people that were sent out to plant in Evergreens.
I love that our vision is to continue to plant churches. We don't want to grow stagnant or become complacent. We want to continue to plant churches and make disciples so that more people like myself, many people in First Nations communities around the province would hear the gospel and have a gospel-centered church in their area. And so that's what we want to be a part of as Grace Fellowship.
That's our heart. We want to continue to see where there's no gospel-centered church and where there's a need. And so we want to continue to plant churches. And there's other places in this city, new areas of the city, where there's, maybe 30,000 people in a community with no gospel-centered church. And so the needs here in our province are great. And we know we can't do everything, but we can continue to just keep being faithful, teaching the word, making disciples, and hopefully continue just to reproduce and multiply for the fame and glory of the one who has given himself for us. That gives me a heart for the people in this province, this country, who are not in a place where they're going to able to just hear the gospel. They're not going to hear, Jesus. They might get pop culture Jesus that they on TV or something like that. But it's not like I was going to tune into a Billy Graham program, and people think, they have access. Well, no, we're not looking. So we need to partner really with the seeking God, and partner with seeking and saving that which is lost and pursuing them. And that's really the heart for why we want to continue to plant churches here, why we want to train up leaders. We want to continue to grow so that we can see more gospel-centered churches go, more disciples made, and people can actually hear the message. This is the greatest news in the universe. It's the only thing we really need, is to hear that this God himself, instead of flicking us out of the universe, though I couldn't have cared less about him, he was pursuing me in love to the point of the cross, laying down his life. He who lived the life I could never have lived, died the death I should have died. Wow. And people don't know this God. They don't know this Jesus, and they need to know the grace and the mercy and the love that's in this fellowship of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We've got to take the message. Who's going to take the message to them? But we get to partner with God in what He's doing. God does the saving, but He allows us to have a part of it, and that's our great confidence. We get to partner with what He's doing, taking this gospel forward here in a province and in a country that so needs this message of the true Jesus.